Welcome back to another positively dreamy episode of You're All Doomed, the podcast that's been nut-kicking its way through Freddy vs. Jason 13 minutes at a time. I'm Brian.
And I'm Greg, and I have a very long machete.
This segment begins with Jason smashing Freddy through a window frame and ends with Monica Keena's name during the closing credits.
Jason has plunged Freddy through the window and, as we mentioned last episode, begins dragging him through the wall down the entire length of the cabin. It's pretty great. That was a really good first major assault from Jason. I was pleased with it. He then hurls Freddy through the air, who lands through the roof of a nearby cabin.
Somewhere in the woods, Linderman is sitting on the ground with his back against a tree, and he's in bad shape because, remember, he got impaled by that shelving spike. Kia is trying to keep him conscious by telling him to say my name, say my name. Linderman says that it's just a scratch and that she should go help the others, but Kia says that she wants to cater to you. Linderman finally convinces Kia that he'll be fine, so she runs off to get help, and as she runs away, we see that Linderman is bleeding out. R.I.P. Linderman.
He was played by Chris Marquette, who appeared in Fanboys, which is where I must have recognized him from years later. He also appeared in Race to Witch Mountain with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and he's on Barry, which is a show that we both like a lot. But this movie is not his first run-in with a child predator. He was also on an episode of Seventh Heaven.
Oh. Bravo. Oof. Take a bow, sir. But not near that guy from Seventh Heaven. Somewhere else in the woods, Will and Lori, who are both injured, are hobbling their way through the camp when Freddy shows up. Just then, Kia arrives and manages to pull Freddy's focus away from them for a minute. Freddy sees Kia and says, "How sweet, dark meat."
Ugh.
Jesus.
God, he's such a fucking asshole.
Apparently, this is a twist on a line that Freddy says in nightmare form, the Dream Master. He says, "How sweet, fresh meat." But still, it doesn't make it any less forgivable.
No, he's just a dick. This gives Will and Lori a chance to hobble away to safety. And Kia decides to continue the distraction by taunting Freddy. She starts off by saying, "So you're the one everybody's afraid of?" And here's the part where I really like Robert Englund's performance a lot. He does this little theatrical bow. And it's kind of what I wish Freddy always was. Some personality. He's not some mindless killing machine. He's got some flourish and panache to him, but he's not a loudmouth. He just does this little menacing, at your service kind of bow. And I love that. It's silent, it's subtle, and it's really scary.
It is, and it's so much more effective than some one-liner that he would usually spout off.
Mm-hmm.
Here I am, bitch, or you get it, bitch. Like just anything that just kind of like undercuts the tension of the moment. But yeah, this is just kind of like they're getting ready to have this showdown, and that little bow is like, yep, this is me.
And then we get into what I find to be the most uncomfortable moment of the movie. And it's when Kia, in a taunting fashion, asks Freddy what kind of faggot wears a red and green Christmas sweater. And I hate to use that word because it's probably the first time I've heard that word said out loud in 20 years. This may have been the last movie that I ever even heard it uttered in, for all I know. And in this era of Pride Month especially, but just, a greater acceptance of different romantic interests, it felt really, really out of place. The only thing that I can use to defend Kia's use of that word is that she's not saying something she believes. I think she was maybe saying something that she knew would anger Freddy. He's clearly established himself as a racist, sexist, rapist asshole. And I'm guessing there's some homophobia in there too. And she is just trying to find any button she can push to keep him there and away from her friends. And so she's really pulling out all the stops. Nevertheless, it took me out of the movie for a second. It was sort of like when we heard Ginny say that Jason was just a frightened retard in part 2. I didn't like hearing it.
Yeah, forgive the pun here, but it was kind of like nails on a chalkboard for me. But I do really think that it is Kia just trying to get under Freddy's skin and just saying things that she knows are going to drive him nuts. Because she even follows it up by saying, like, you're not even scary. And, like, what are those on your gloves? Are they butter knives? So, like, I think she knows that her time is almost up, and she's just like, I'm going to get in my own licks the only way that I can. And so I'm just going to say things to you that I know that are going to just really piss you off. Yeah.
And I know from a story perspective, that makes sense. I wish they'd maybe found a different way to get that across, but this is a time capsule. We're watching a movie from 2003. We've come a long way, and it was a throwback to an era when that kind of language would be thrown around a lot more freely.
And there are some lines that she could have said that would have, been just as effective. She could have said something like, am I too old for you? Like, am I not your type? Like that kind of thing. Just little things to piss them off. But yeah, I think it's done mostly for shock value. But unfortunately, I also think that it was probably done for comedic value when this movie came out, to get people to laugh. But from a character standpoint, I really just think it's Kia just taking whatever shot she can at him while she can.
I do like that she then compares his deadly signature glove to butter knives and compares them to maybe his tiny wiener, implying that Jason has a huge machete, which means he's got a giant dick. But I like that Freddy then kind of amusedly points behind her. So she turns and sees that Jason is standing there. He's unimpressed with her complimenting the size of his unit and slashes her aside with such force that she's flung hard against a tree.
So now that she's gone, R.I.P. Kia.
Kia was played by Kelly Rowland, who, as Brian has been alluding to with his incessant spouting of Destiny's Child titles, was 1/3 of the popular singing group. I didn't realize that their first major label debut song was on the Men in Black soundtrack in 1997. Most of the rest of her credits are actually as herself or are Destiny's Child themed, so I didn't really bother to dig too deeply. So Kia's death here makes me wonder, does Beyonce exist in this universe? Because, I would think that Queen Bey exists across all timelines. So that would mean that Destiny's Child would have to exist in the world of this movie. So does Kia just look like Destiny's Child singer Kelly Rowland? I just wanted to say Queen Bey to show my street cred. I had to watch a YouTube video to make sure I pronounced it correctly.
I do like the idea that Kia is potentially actually a member of Destiny's Child, but she's just living this unassuming life in Springwood as, Laurie and Will's friend.
And that's why the band broke up, because she got murdered by Jason.
Right. Speaking of getting murdered by Jason, and this is up for debate, but Kia is actually Jason's final kill in the film series.
Oh, you're right. Over at the dock, Will wants to escape in a boat, but Laurie refuses, saying she wants to stay and watch Freddy die. Freddy is now jumping all over Jason and slashing at him, even doing an elbow drop at one point. It's surprisingly acrobatic for Freddy.
So Freddy and Jason are hacking the ever-living shit out of each other, and we start to realize that they're actually fighting on a construction site at the old Camp Crystal Lake. They're in the early stages of building some sort of luxury condominiums for this Lake Crystal Resorts. After a bunch of slices and kicks and punches, Freddy gets briefly knocked on his ass. One of his claws accidentally punctures an oxygen tank of some sort, which goes flying across the construction site like a missile. For some reason, there are dozens of these tanks on site, so Freddy starts puncturing a bunch of them to shoot at Jason. Most of them miss, but one of them knocks Jason down hard enough that he seems to dislocate his shoulder. And as Jason is pulling himself together, Freddy has made his way to the top of some scaffolding where he topples a bunch of rebar down onto Jason. Most of the rebar misses, but one goes through his leg while the other goes through his chest and pins him to the ground. Freddy then knocks loose a cement pourer that swings around until it strikes Jason in his head. Jason's pretty much getting his ass handed to him at this point.
Yeah, and there's a lot of screen time being eaten up by this sequence. There's a lot of heavy metallic construction equipment that's swinging and rolling around. Freddy even gets knocked off the perch at one point. And as Jason frees himself, the big swinging cement pourer slams both of them all the way out onto the boat dock. Jason is the first back up on his feet and begins carving Freddy up. Will and Laurie are pumping gasoline all over the place, just as Freddy manages to slice through Jason's right fingers, which dislodges the machete, which Freddy can then grab. Freddy then begins using the machete against Jason, which really shouldn't be as big a deal as it is. It's like it's taking Jason down as though this were his mystical sword or something.
Or like the enchanted jewel-encrusted dagger.
Right. You know, it's again, they're putting a little too much emphasis on Jason having a machete. Blood is spraying everywhere, and there is one nice move of a double swipe where Freddy slashes at Jason with both the glove and the machete. And then Freddy plunges his glove blades into Jason's eye holes as Laurie is doing a slow-mo Michael Bay charge out onto the dock with 2 Olympic torches. Laurie yells, "Freddy, go to hell!" And the fire distracts him long enough that Jason is able to ram his fist into Freddy's side. Into Freddy's side. He tears Freddy's arm off as Freddy slowly plunges the machete deep into Jason's torso. They're cradling each other in this bloody orgasm of death. It's almost homoerotic.
Will and Laurie dive into the lake just as the propane tank next to the dock explodes, sending both Jason and Freddy flying into the lake. Will and Laurie come up from the surface and climb onto the dock. They're okay!
And I think we see that Monica Keena has a tattoo of a ladybug just above her butt.
I noticed that too. Laurie and Will are embracing because they're finally safe. But then suddenly they hear footsteps. It's someone holding a machete, so it must be Jason. Nope. It's one-armed Freddy. Just as he's about to dispose of Will and Laurie, we see Freddy's glove burst through the front of Freddy's chest.
Jason has risen from the waters to impale Freddy with his own arm before flopping backwards into the water that is deep enough to submerge him, but shallow enough that he was able to stand up and stab Freddy.
As Freddy falls to his knees, Laurie picks up the machete that Freddy has just dropped and screams, "Welcome to my world, bitch!" and chops off Freddy's head. And I will say, the number of times that we heard that line throughout this movie, this payoff was absolutely worth it.
Granted. She had every reason to say that. Freddy's head sinks into the lake, and Jason, who floats for a moment, shares a last glimpse with Laurie. They seem to have an understanding now. His eyes flutter closed, and he too sinks into the waters of Crystal Lake one final time. Laurie then tosses his machete into the water as a gesture of respect, and she and Will limp back to shore.
It's now the next morning, and we see Jason rise up, slowly walking out of the lake. In his left hand, he's holding his trusted machete, and in his right hand, Freddy's severed head. So it's pretty clear that Jason wins. Or did he? Because as the camera zooms in on Freddy's head, Freddy turns to the camera and winks, and then we then hear Freddy's patented laugh as the movie fades to black.
There are a couple of things about this sequence that I really like. First is that Jason is holding Freddy's head with the hand that has no fingers, so he's palming him like a basketball. The other thing I really like is that the landscape is this sort of misty, dreamlike morning. There's fog that roils across the serene waters of Crystal Lake, almost as if if this is the dream realm, which leads me to wonder if perhaps this whole thing has been Freddy toying with Jason in the land of dreams.
I think it's possible because, after all, anything can happen. But I'd have to go back kind of like how I did with my most recent viewing of the original Nightmare and kind of view it through that lens and see if there's anything that kind of really would contradict that. But
well, if anything could happen, what would contradict it? Because anything can happen.
That's true. But, excluding the remakes, this really is the end of Freddy and Jason. So I'm leaning more toward the idea that this actually happened in the real world.
I mean, we can debate this endlessly, and we probably should. That's why we're here. But, I don't see this movie as truly part of the canon of Friday the 13th. I would even postulate that what we think of as Jason's prime timeline ended at the conclusion of Jason Takes Manhattan, and that anything beyond that is an alternate timeline or apocryphal in some way. This doesn't refer to specific continuity of other characters beyond Jason's basic story. And it even gets some of those details wrong, as we discussed. So this can almost be viewed separately from the main thread of movies that we've now discussed for 11 seasons.
Or in my case, just completely ignored.
Indeed. We then have the closing credits sequence. This movie was written by Damian Shannon and Mark Swift, but we'll come back to them because they actually wrote the reboot that we're looking forward to covering next season. And the movie was directed by Ronnie Yu, whose early work I recognize most from Warriors of Virtue, which is like some sort of magical kung fu kangaroo movie or some shit. I didn't see it, but he also directed The Bride of Chucky, in which he directed both Jason Ritter and John Ritter. Ronnie Yu had polio as a child, resulting in a very long, isolated recovery, which led him to immerse himself in worlds of fantasy and imagination, and that led him to an interest in directing film. He hasn't had this was his biggest mainstream project. He hasn't had a ton of credits since then, but is continuing to work, so maybe he'll do something interesting next. As we close out the movie, we had 3 deaths this episode: Linderman, Kia, and possibly Freddy Krueger.
To hear all about my audition to replace Beyoncé in Destiny's Child, you'll just have to tune in next week to the next episode of You're All Doomed.